Richards as dendritic drainage because of the way and I thought I was using the correct word, that dendritic drainage was the way the hollows tended to bring the drainages down to feeder streams that then went into the Ohio. And she corrected me on that, but I forget what word she used for the particular. She said that's not exactly right. But it's not it's not irregular in that the ridge, this ridge, which is actually more or less continuous from just about here all the way to Cincinnati, and separates what would you call that band of land, the river frontage from the inland of Ohio is pretty much broken by this ridge, which runs parallel to the river, so nominally east-west, and therefore it drains off to the north and to the south into a major set of streams, Upper Twin and Lower Twin and all of those. And then they go to larger creeks or rivers like Ohio Brush and the Scioto, and then they go into the Ohio.
Trellis.
I believe it was. I believe it was trellis. That probably is right, yeah. Trellis system. But at any rate, there was a time around the turn of the last century when there were essentially no trees in this section of Ohio. It had all been logged, and people tended to put their houses on the ridge tops because they desperately needed the small areas of bottom land to grow crops. So that's why you end up with the situation that I have, which is having at a really inhospitable and very difficult to get to place a graveyard. When you would think, well, why would they put a graveyard there? Because there must have been times of the year when they'd have to hold bodies for weeks at a time before they could even get them up to the ridgetop. I mean, there's some times that I can't get in and out, and I'm assuming they had the same problem. Then the whole place, this is third growth forest by and large around here. And the ridgetops became the least desirable location for houses because it was so much easier to build a house in the bottomland or, along the roads. And certainly after rural electrification, it was desirable to have a house close to the power lines because you could connect to the electric grid. Which is a roundabout way of saying that the ridge tops have been generally considered to be unbuildable because they're of difficult access.
What did the people do who lived up here when there were no trees? What did they do for water?
That's a really good question. They hauled it from someplace because the water table is discontinuous, and I was advised when I even remotely thought about drilling a well not to do it because you could drill 300 feet and not hit the water table because it doesn't seem that it should be because we're so close to the Ohio River that you would think there would be a layer of water that underlay everything, but it doesn't really seem to be the case. So at any rate, it means that in modern times, I bought this land 12 years ago. The ridgetops were not very desirable because essentially all that anyone does on them now is grow trees. And this piece of property is surrounded by the state forest on 3 sides. And the state forest 12 years ago wanted to purchase it from this real estate dealer, a wonderful guy, as it turns out, in a little town called Peebles, north of here. And the state forest wanted to purchase the land from him, and they had even arrived at the price. The price was just a uniform price that the state forest was at that time willing to pay for land, and that was $500 an acre. But fortunately, the state forest ran out of money. And I happened to be visiting on a reading tour with Samara, actually, at that time. I had gone up to Erie, Pennsylvania, and read for Diana's feminist studies class, the only male to read for her feminist studies class, and a couple of other places. And then I had a small reading gig here in Portsmouth. And I was staying with Brian and Dawn, and this must have been in the late spring. In the early spring, yes, it was, because Samara was on spring break. Earlier that spring, there had been a phenomenal flood, a highly localized but phenomenal flood. It rained 20 inches in 12 hours or something like that. But because of the nature of the drainage, it only affected certain drainage sets within the overall drainage. And it was really pretty spectacular. It had lifted houses off foundations, it had washed out bridges. And Brian wanted to drive me around to look at the damage from it because there was a interesting phenomenon. And that phenomenon was that the upper limit of the floodwaters was delineated with plastic bags that had floated on the high water. So you'd be driving on the road, which tend to follow the bottoms, and you'd be driving along and look up 30 feet, and there would be a line of plastic bags in the trees. So briefly, and it was really briefly, for instance, on Upper Twin, Kamiakin's bridge washed out. They got to high ground and their house was flooded, but not seriously. And the entire sequence, the rain lasted 12 hours and the flood lasted like 3 hours after that, and then it was gone. So the water just rose up and went right back down immediately. And in the course of driving around looking at that damage, we had stopped to talk with another writer, a Croatian writer, Josef, whose last name I can't even pronounce. And Josef lives near here where this ridge is. And he had found this piece of property that was 50 acres, 25 acres of which was across the road from the house that he had bought with another 7 acres on it. And he wanted the 25 acres, but he didn't want 50 acres, nor could he afford it. And it's an interesting sidebar on this is that the division of properties in countries, areas of the country like this where there are highly localized drainages, hollows, is that a certain piece of land will generally encompass an entire drainage. So this 50-acre piece of property, when divided into two 25-acre pieces of property, I own the entire drainage of Low Gap Hollow. And Josef owns the entire drainage of whatever the next hollow over. I don't really know what the name of it is, but this is Low Gap Hollow, and at the bottom of it is a seasonal creek, Low Gap Creek, that flows into McEltree Creek, which flows into Turkey Creek, which flows into the Scioto River. And Josef was serious about buying the 25 acres. I, of course, didn't have any money, but my divorce settlement was going to be coming up. And I went over to talk to the real estate guy. And he took a liking to me in the fact that I wanted this piece of property that a lot of people considered more or less useless, except as a tree farm. And I outlined my plans to him. And I told him that I would probably have the money within a year, or that I could get the money within a year. And he asked me if I had $1. And I said, yeah. And he said, well, give me the $1 and I'll hold the land for you. So he ended up holding the land for 9 months for that $1. I wasn't originally going to build on the ridge top because there was an old bridge in Portsmouth called the 2nd Street Bridge. And it was being replaced. There was the Ohio Department of Transportation was replacing it, and it was an old steel truss bridge, and they were replacing it with a modern ugly, flat concrete things that replaced a lot of beautiful old bridges. But the be-all and end-all of that was that there was suddenly on the market a huge amount of steel, including the main I-beams that were under the trusses of the bridge that were 65 feet long, 3 feet deep, and had 1-foot flanges on the top and bottom. So these pieces of steel were enormously heavy and very, very awkward, but they were really quite cheap. They were like $500 a piece. So my original plan was to find a place where it was exactly 65 feet between the two ridges that I own. And I was going to build a house on 2 I-beams that would bridge the chasm of the hollow. And I wished until 1997 that I had done that. no, not 97, 2003 that I had done that. But in the ice storm of 2003, where I would have built the house had 14 trees that came down on the very site that I'd chosen. So it's a damn good thing that I didn't. There was an outstanding timber contract on this property, but it was for selective cutting, only trees larger than 18 inches in diameter. And I could have bought the contract out for $4,000, but I met the guy who was going to log it, and Froggy, and Froggy looked like a good guy, and I realized that he had a problem that might play into my hands, and his problem was that for a logging operation, you have to have a loading area, and the property didn't present a loading area, and in fact, he was perplexed about how he was going to get his damn logs out of here. So I proposed to him that we increase the scope of the skid road that would have to go to the top of the ridge, and that if he would do that with a dozer, I would pay for the gravel, and he could stage his logs at the top of the ridge, and by doing that, that would pack the driveway down, and he'd end up with an easy way to get his logs in and out, and I'd end up with a driveway. It was a great idea, and it did work out, but neither of us had foreseen that it would take 100 dump truck loads of gravel to fill the driveway, because this is Low Gap Hollow. It was the last of the roads across the ridge line, and it was the last corduroy road in Scioto County. And a corduroy road is completely laid up with logs perpendicular to the roadbed, and they have to be changed out every year. And the reason for that was that the ground was so soft at the top of at the bridge that goes across. So when Froggy started hauling gravel for the driveway, he hauled 40 loads of gravel to get the first 100 feet. And I thought that I was looking at, what was going to be the world's most expensive driveway. But after that, it was, another 60 loads of gravel did the rest of the half mile of the driveway. So that's how I ended up on the ridgetop.
I have to speak.
Yes, you can speak.
I just have to speak now. I'm making sounds. That's all. I've been mute over here. And going, trying not to laugh out loud. I'm just letting it go. There we go. I'm done.
Thank you. Appreciate
I'm
it.
done.
Getting a
You have
clean track.
I knew what I was doing. Tom knew what I was doing too, I imagine.
Yeah. Well, I think Tom's getting used to people going. That's really-
Oh God, Mac with his booming voice, man! I couldn't get him to the basement quick enough yesterday.
Oh, with Lane, I know. I'm going there going. Oh. And I had him with the similar kind of deal, and it was picking up like he was shouting into the mic. So,
Oh wow, yeah,
and
sure.
And I
The legs be so soft, you probably have the sound way up, right?
well, yeah, it was okay.
How did it go with Lane? Was it pretty good?
Interestingly enough, he was concerned